How do you pick your podcast name, your niche, write your show description, pick your music, all of that jazz? We are covering this in this episode with my friend Nick Nalbach, and you are going to absolutely love this conversation because we deep dive into these topics and your episode structure as it relates to podcasting. In case you're new around here or you want a refresher, you can join us on Patreon for more behind the scenes Q&A, answers to your questions, access to all of the episodes in advance at the beginning of the month, all together at the same time, and ad-free versions of the episodes. I would love to see you over there, so be sure to check it out. The link is in the show notes. Now, today's conversation is about setting up the foundational items for your podcast so that you're not launching into the abyss, or even worse, launching to nobody. I think that might be a little bit worse because there's so much time, so much effort, so much thought and intention that goes into creating a podcast. You want people to listen when you get to the finish line. Now I'm going to ask you, do you know who you're talking to with your podcast? What are the key elements that you need to consider when picking your show name? What makes your podcast searchable? And how do you structure your episodes? And what about creating a show description? We talk about all of these points and more in this conversation. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about Nick so you can know all about him and feel like you've already met him before we dive into this conversation. From podcast host to podcast coach and producer, Nick Nalbach truly understands the struggle and fears that come with putting your message and story out into the world. Nick's mission is not just to help coaches and entrepreneurs launch a podcast. His goal is to empower these leaders to share their message and knowledge with the world. The goal is to build deep and meaningful connections with their community and establish them as the leading go-to experts in their niche. All right, let's get into this episode. Nick, we are back with episode 2 of the As It Relates to Podcasting podcast, where we're talking all about the foundations for your show. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, we made it through episode 1. We successfully made it through episode 1.
With all of the tech issues that we will not tell anybody about. No, I'm just kidding. I've just told everyone. I'm kidding. It was on my end, not Nick's. But I'm not surprised to hear that because tech and me, Nick, I don't know. I'm pretty good at helping other people with their tech, but for my stuff, for some reason, I don't know. Sometimes it doesn't.
It was a hiccup.
It was a small hiccup. That's right. Okay. In this episode, we are talking about how to pick your name, your niche, how to create your episode structure, and how to ultimately decide if you want a solo episode, guest interviews, and all that kind of stuff. So I know that you know as well as I know this is a huge topic. Is there anything that you want to start off right off the bat with saying, or should we just go into it one by one?
The one thing I want to jump off straight out of the gate is don't do what I did with my show.
Oh no. What's that?
So, everything from the title to the cover art, everything I just completely botched. I thought I was being kind of clever with it.
Okay.
And I was keeping it on brand. I have the 9-5 to Freedom brand.
Yeah.
And so I naturally was like, okay, the 9-5 podcast. Well, going back now, there's multiple 9-5, 9-5, screw the 9-5, a bunch of different variations of the 9-5 podcast. And not only that, 9-5 podcast, what does that even mean? Unless you were already in my ecosystem, what does that even mean? So I am actually, as we're recording this, in the process of working through a slight rebrand and relaunch of the podcast with a brand new name, cover art, everything. So I can get right everything that I did wrong the first time around.
That's actually hilarious. And also is something that I always say to myself. Like if I were to go back and relaunch the Happiness Happens podcast from the start, there's like 1,000,005 things that I would do differently. So I definitely hear you. And it's nice to do like a little rebrand, like a little, yeah, it's nice. It's gonna be really good. I'm excited. We'll put the links in the show notes to make sure everyone can get your podcast. Okay, let's start off by talking about some key things that people need to know when it comes to picking the name of their podcast.
So we already kind of hit on one.
Yeah.
Does it make sense?
Yeah.
If you have an idea for a podcast, think about what someone, if they stumble on just scrolling through Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, if they come to that podcast, are they going to know what it is?
Right.
Are they going to know what it's about? That's what's ultimately going to get them to stop. If they can't decipher what that podcast is going to be about, they might scroll right past it. And it could have been the perfect podcast for them, but they didn't know.
Totally. I love that. I think that's actually so key. And this is the thing too, that I run into a lot with when I'm working with my clients and we're figuring out the name of their podcast. Even when I was naming this podcast, my podcast producer, literally, he just threw it out. He was like, as it relates to podcasting. And I was like, oh my God. I was like, that is a great name. Like, I love that because it makes sense. But what happens when you're creating a podcast that's not so specific, right? Like what happens if you're creating a podcast and you want to get a little bit creative with, your title and stuff like that? I think one of the key things, in my opinion, that people need to pay attention to is like, is it actually searchable? You know what I mean? Like, is it something that people are going to be looking for? And and then to your point, when they land on it, are they going to actually know what it's all about?
Right. Yeah. No made up words that you made up, no inside jokes, because people aren't going to understand it.
People are like, what does this mean?
It sounds super fun and clever when you're in it. And then you're like, why isn't anybody finding my podcast?
That's right.
Well, no one knows what that means.
Exactly. And honestly, I think that even with my Happiness Happens podcast, I think I experienced a little bit of that too, because when I first started the show, like to me, it made sense. I was like, oh, happiness happens. Like, it sounds great. And then, it's not something that people would search, if that makes any sense. Not that they need to be like searching for those words specifically, but when I talk to people and I tell them the name of that show, they're like, oh, like that's so fun. Like that's such like so clever. Like what a good idea. And I'm like, oh yeah, thanks. And like we talk about, mindset and like how to live a happier life and like all of that. I think that part lends itself well to it, but I think also it can be like a little bit confusing for people sometimes. But yeah. Okay. What's next on the list?
So actually a really fascinating thing regarding adding keywords to your podcast. Now, you mentioned making the podcast title searchable.
Mm-hmm.
What are people going to type in that they would then land on your podcast? And I can't remember for the life of me. I'll have to find it. But there was someone that was talking about a podcast they did, and it was all about Instagram growth hacks, social media, like that type of stuff.
Yeah.
And they, within a very short period of time, went from no podcast to the number one podcast. Like when you searched Instagram, they were the number one search result on Apple Podcasts. And it was just a matter of them including some keyword around Instagram in the title of that podcast. And there wasn't a whole lot of podcasts that were doing it at that time because they were trying to be clever and cute with their titles.
Yeah.
So when someone searches Instagram, Apple's like, well, here's a podcast about Instagram. And he quickly shot up. So I would say definitely don't discredit the use of keywords. Don't like go bananas with it.
Right.
But definitely, if you can, if it makes sense to, incorporate keywords into that title because it will make it more discoverable and potentially found by a lot more people than if you had some made up word as your podcast title.
No, that is so true. And I love that you mentioned that, especially like I think about for myself, like when I'm searching for something very specific that I want to learn about, like I go to Apple Podcasts and I type into the search bar, okay, I don't know why I would be searching parenting because I'm not a parent, but I have a lot of parenting clients. So like I'll be searching something specific to parenting, let's say, and I'll be searching like, I don't know, like parenting your kids. That's just a terrible example.
Works. Play it.
But the podcast that if your podcast has those keywords in it, it's going to come up. And also if your episode titles have that stuff in it, like those keywords in it, it's also going to come up. So yes, very powerful to have keywords in what you're doing. I think that's super important. Now, when it comes to picking your name, especially nowadays, I think like one of the things that I see so much and I hear so much of is people are always like, okay, but every single name is taken, right? Like there's so many podcasts, so many different podcast names. Every name that I want is taken. Then what? Like, what would you recommend someone to do to help find a name that they may really like?
I mean, I always think it's a good idea to do some research up front. Search for the topic that your show is going to be about,
yeah,
and see what is out there. And I mean, how you could use something like Answer the Public and see what questions people are asking. Maybe there's other keywords that they mean the same thing, but they're not exactly that keyword, but it's potentially still getting searched. They're just searching in a different way.
Right.
But another thing, because I thought about this with the rebranding of my own show.
Yeah.
The plan, kind of like, I think your audience will get the exclusive on it. The plan was,
That's so
I don't think I've
exciting.
told it to like anybody. So the plan is to change it from the 9-5 podcast to Freedom from the 9-5.
Oh, I love
It's
that.
not a huge change, but it's a huge change. With that, I was almost thinking of adding kind of like a subtitle to that to further explain, like touch on entrepreneurship and be able to incorporate keywords like entrepreneurship or 6-figure, 7-figure business owner or something along those lines to hit on those keywords.
Yeah.
But I'm also hesitant about making it too long.
True. But that's exactly who you're targeting. I like that.
It's a way to, if say you're, because I'm very much in the entrepreneur business space of podcasting. Say you're doing like a digital marketing podcast. Like you can't call it digital marketing podcast because there's probably a million of them.
Right.
But you could do somewhat of a clever title and include digital marketing inside of that podcast title to kind of differentiate yourself from that.
I like that.
You're still hitting the keyword and it's still something that's a little bit more unique.
Yeah. No, I think that's so good. When we're picking names, like when we're going through, like if my clients and I are like trying to find a name for their podcast, I think some of the key things that, we're always looking for is what are some of the things that like stick out to you to begin with? Like some of the names that you already love, right? Writing all of those different names down and having them in front of you, because it's so much easier to like see all the different options when they're in front of you. And we actually will go to like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and we'll go to Google and different podcast apps. And I go in and I start to like search these different names and like see what, comes up. And so by doing that, it kind of gives you this different perspective to like see, like you were saying, like what else is out there, what are people naming their shows and all that kind of stuff. And then on the flip side, what's really good too about that, I feel like, is if you come across like even like an episode that's titled something related to what you're searching for, that might spark like some creativity to, pick your name. And so I think it's just really important for people to keep in mind that you want, like you were saying, your name to like be understandable. You want it to be, is it understandable? That's a word. Yeah, that's a word. Okay. It's like, wait, what? You want it to be understandable and you want people to know exactly what they're getting when they come to your podcast. You want it to be discoverable. You want, to be able to use those keywords and like leverage that. But then at the same time, like you also don't want to be taking somebody else's name, because like we've had this happen as well, where we launch a podcast and somebody else like comes in and like literally takes your podcast name. And like I guess you can do that if you really want to, but like you really shouldn't do that, because I don't know. I've sent out cease and desists before to like forget, like
really?
People, yeah, because it's like you build a whole brand around this specific name, and like you may have trademarks for some of it and stuff like that, and then people will just kind of go in and like take whatever they whatever they want. They're like, oh, it's a good name, let me like piggyback off of it.
That's really interesting.
Yeah,
because it's kind of building off the cloud of a brand that someone else has already built. That's interesting.
Exactly. Is there anything else that you would add in terms of like key things that people need to know when it comes to picking your podcast name?
I mean, I would say if you can keep it simple, it's going to be a lot easier to tell people to go check out this podcast that's 3 or 4 words long than giving them a big long title. That's something I've thought about a lot, listening to some other podcasts that are able to kind of abbreviate and brand. And I don't know, I've listened to the Smart Passive Income podcast for a long time. And the fact that his entire brand now, he's able to say, go check out the SPI podcast, the Smart Passive Income, like something about those 3 words roll really smooth. So I would say the shorter, the better, if possible.
I like that.
But I feel like that's just kind of my own personal preference. I don't know. What do you think on that?
I think that's so true because I mean, when you start making it too long, first of all, I mean, like cover art itself is very small, right? Like if you
That's true.
can't see what the podcast is called by looking at the cover art, like you have too many words on there. But no, I definitely agree with you. Like you want it to be memorable. You want it to be like short enough for it to like roll off the tongue or for people to be like, oh yeah, like that makes a lot of sense, or for people to remember it and be able to recommend it to other people. And they're like, oh, I was listening to this, podcast. It's called As It Relates to Podcasting. And it's like, oh, like kind of like, okay, what are we learning? Oh, we're learning about podcasting. Right. And so it makes sense that way.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you 100%. I think that's super key. And so, once you have your name figured out, and this is just, for our listeners today, we're going to make sure that we're breaking down all of these different pieces because I feel like, and I don't know what you think too, these are kind of like the fundamentals of like starting your show. Like you need to have a name, you need to have a niche, you need to know who you're talking to, you need to have music, you need to have structure to your podcast. Like you need to know what kind of podcast you're going to be creating. Right. So when it comes to your niche and like understanding your niche, what would be some of like the must do things that people should do right off the bat? And even if you already have a podcast, especially because you're going through a rebrand right now, it's cool because you can kind of shed light on like both sides, like from when you started your podcast and from when you're, rebranding it.
Yeah. I think for one, I guess kind of going back to the last episode, we were talking about the mindset things. Everything that we're talking about here in this episode, don't let this be an excuse for you to not take action. Because I think in one aspect, working on the title and the cover art and getting all this stuff kind of ironed out, it makes it real.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it can be used as a crutch, kind of like what we were talking about last episode where, oh, well, I can't think of a podcast title. So I have to put everything else on hold with the podcast until I come up with this podcast title.
Yes.
You can always come back to some of this stuff before you launch. It's not official until it's official.
Yeah.
So
totally.
Don't let it be a crutch.
Totally.
But I think title is huge because it's going to be one of the first things people see.
Yeah.
The cover art is huge because that literally will be the first thing they see. I think that's possibly more important than the title because that's the first glance. They're going to see the cover and that's either going to get them to stop scrolling. It's going back to like social media rules here. How do we get them to stop scrolling and find out more?
Exactly.
So we want them to see that cover and be like, ooh, what's that? Read the title. Ooh, what's that? Open this up. Okay, what is the podcast about? Let's read the description and figure out. Let's scroll through some of the episodes, see what the episodes are about. Like, these are all things that I didn't think about when I started, and I'm thinking about now. So if you can be very intentional up front, you're going to save yourself a lot of time and hopefully bring in a lot more people early on versus realizing later on down the road, well, like, man, the cover, it just doesn't stand out to anybody else. Yeah. The title doesn't really tell me anything. And then the description is just kind of like, it's kind of blah. It's thinking about I came from like an SEO kind of background.
Oh, that's
and it's all about search intent. It's the user intent. So when someone lands on your show, what is the intention? Or they search for a keyword, what is the intention? You want that intention to be like, oh, that's the podcast I want. So I think the cover art, the title, and the description are three of like the most important things to think about right out of the gate if you want to be discovered.
I completely agree with you. And I also think too, it gives you this like opportunity, especially in the description, like you can kind of tell them exactly what you want them to do next. Like you can add in all of your social media links. Like you can add in, if you have like a Patreon, if you have a membership, if you have all kinds of stuff, right? Like you put that directly into your show description. And then you're already giving people, next steps to do, like subscribe to my show, like all of those different things. Because I think call to actions throughout everything is so important. But yeah, no, 100%. I totally agree with you. And, when it comes to those setting up like those fundamental things, like, I mean, there's other things, like there's so many different pieces that go into creating a podcast, right? You have, like you were saying, you have your show description, you have your cover art, you have the name of the show. And then from there, you also have the music that you choose, right? For your intro and outro, which means you need to have an intro and outro, right? And you need to have your episodes. Like you need to know what kind of episodes you want to be creating. What's the structure of your show? Like there are so many different pieces that kind of roll into that, you know?
It's essentially you're building a brand. You're not just launching a podcast. So, I mean, branding rules, you want everything to kind of mesh together, and you want it all to kind of feed the message that you want to get out into the world. So everything you're saying, including the intro and your music and everything, it's a part of this brand that you're building.
Yeah.
It's not just the show.
Exactly.
So yeah, you want that message to get across right.
Exactly. Oh, that is so true. And so when you're creating your podcast, so like one of the things that I always get my clients to do and to write out before they start anything, before, you know, even some clients come with no name, right? Like they don't know what they want the name of their podcast to be. And so one thing that I always get them to do is to write out like a mission statement for their podcast. Like, you know, what is this show? What's the purpose of the show? Who is it serving and why? And I feel like when you can answer those questions, that part is so key because that's what drives your intro. That's what drives your outro. That's what drives your show description and your trailer, right? When you can know exactly what the purpose of the podcast is and exactly who it's serving, I think that's so important. What do you think about that?
I'm 100% in agreement. I think that purpose, that why, is the lifeblood of that podcast.
Yeah.
That is ultimately what's going to get you past pod fade. If
Yes.
anyone listening is like, what's pod fade? It's essentially a lot of podcasters will get started. They'll get a few episodes in and then they'll be like, I just not feeling it. I'm not hitting the numbers I want, whatever it is. They end up quitting. Majority quit before episode. I think it's like 7 now. It keeps getting lower and lower.
Yeah.
And I honestly think a lot of that is because there's no real purpose behind the show. There's no real why.
Exactly. And you know what? Even if your why is to make money from it and like have it be like a source of revenue for your business, for example, like that's totally fine. You know what I mean? Like that is totally fine. That is a very valid why if that's your why. But then you have to like anchor yourself in that. You know what I mean? On those days that you don't want to show up, on those days where you don't want to record your content, and on the days that you know, don't really want to do your show, you remember like, okay, no, but this is like a tool for my business. This is like, you know, something that helps me grow my business. It brings a different stream of income into my business. And therefore that's why I want to do it. You know what I mean? So it's like your why will always be so personal to like you as a person. But can literally be anything so long as you're like actually anchored in it and it's something that's important to you, I think is important.
Yeah. And I would say, because this was something you hear everyone talk about it. What is your why?
Yeah.
What's the goal? What's the purpose? And I think we get so bombarded with that it's just like we become numb to it. It's like, yeah, of course we need to know the why and kind of brush it off.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm guilty of that just as much as anybody. But it wasn't until I actually sat down and sincerely thought about this question, like dig deep, like the first answer that you come up with is not like the core. That's not the real goal or purpose. You have to keep digging deeper, like, and why, and why,
Exactly.
and why. Keep asking yourself why until you can't ask yourself why anymore. Like, okay, I want to start a podcast. Why? Because I want to make money. Why? So that I can leave my job behind. Why? So that I can spend more time with my family. Why? Because we really want to like do all these do all these things, and you just keep drilling down to it until you really understand that real why. And then everything else that you're doing with your podcast should be taking steps towards that. And you have that goal always there. Like, if I don't do this, if I'm not intentional with my episodes, if I'm not intentional with what I'm doing, I'm not going to get closer to my goal. I'm not going to get closer to my real why.
I love that. I'm so glad that you went there because I think it's so important. And, you know, when you were talking, I kept thinking to myself, like, you know, we do this, and this again links back to what we were talking about in the very first episode. You know, all of these things that we do when we're young, when we're small, right? And how many times do you ask your parents, like, are we going here? Why? Yes, we're going here. Okay, but why? And it's like, but why? But why? But why? And you know what I mean? And so like, we're good at questioning things. We're good at asking why when there's no additional reasoning around it. Right. And so that is so good. It's so important. And I absolutely love that. And so now that you have like your why, you have your name, you have your, ideas for your intro, your outro, your trailer, your show description, how important would you say it would be to like niche down before doing all of those different things and like understand exactly who it is that you're talking to before you start creating all of this different content and marketing materials and ultimately like pieces of content?
I mean, I would say that is probably important to do that right out of the gate, just because who your audience is, who you're speaking to, is going to determine all of these things that we're kind of talking about.
Right.
If you go and make the title and the description and all this stuff, and you're just making it for the sake of making it, and then you realize, okay, this particular audience is who I'm talking to. Well, if the title and the cover art and the description and your intro and none of that stuff is speaking to them, then what's the point? The
Right.
people that you want to speak to are going to see that and they're going to be like, okay, well, that's not for me.
Exactly.
So you really need to think about what the show is going to be about and who it's for. And then I personally think it would make everything a lot easier kind of building it together. Like, is my show about business moms, like boss moms that are crushing it at home? Is it for, I don't know, is it for someone who wants like entertainment, or is it an entrepreneur? Like, thinking about who it is that you're actually speaking to. And then it's like, okay, what would a boss mom click on?
Exactly.
What would what would someone else in another field that I can't think of right now, what would they click on? You kind of going back to that intention that I was saying and putting yourself in their seat and saying, okay, if I was this person, why would I click on this?
Exactly.
What would make me click on this show?
Exactly. And also it's always like a previous, more often than not, it's always like a previous version of you, right? Especially if you have a podcast that's like in that entrepreneurial space, like odds are whoever you're coaching and whoever you're helping, what is where you were, right? And so it's important, I think, to remember that too, that like, I don't know, you gotta, like, I just think that's so important to remember. Like, you are literally helping the people who are listening to your podcast move from a place where you once were before and into where they want to be now. And so all of those different things, it's almost like putting yourself back into like, what would I have needed then? What would have been important to me then? And, how can I create that for the person that's listening to my show?
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, when we talk about like the structure of a podcast episode, because this is one of the things that we go through, I like my clients, I know your clients as well, like, what type of podcast do you want to have? Like, do you want to have a solo podcast? Is it a guest interview podcast? What's the structure of your episodes, right? Like, where does your intro fit? Does it come before the musical intro? How do you just record your intro and outro separately? Like, all of those different things, like with the cadence of the entire podcast episode. How do you go about picking, or what would you recommend to our listeners in terms of creating their style of podcast? Because really, and this is my own opinion, you can create a podcast however you want to create it. Like, there's no rules set in stone about how it should be. I just think that it's important that however you decide to do it is consistent every single week, and you're not changing things up every single week to like confuse people,
I would agree with that to an extent.
Okay.
I would say, first off, if you're trying to figure it out, you don't really know what you want, how you want your show to be, I would say go listen to other podcasts. If you already have this idea of what you want your show to be about, go into Apple Podcasts, Spotify. I really like Listen Notes. I use Listen Notes so much for research. You can type in your topic that you want your show to be about and just go listen to some of the other podcasts that are in that niche, because that might just tell you outright, like, a lot of entrepreneur podcasts are interview heavy podcasts.
Yeah.
So if you're going to do an entrepreneur podcast, maybe it makes sense to continue going with people are familiar with versus completely changing the script and making it something totally different. But I think regardless, it's a good idea to kind of get that, I don't know, listening to the other podcasts and seeing what resonates with you and what you like the best and what you want to use. But now to your point about like sticking to one and being consistent, I agree with it in terms of like, I'm thinking of a true crime podcast where it's very story driven narrative. You're kind of taking people along through the story and through the scenes of everything. You're almost like narrating the whole thing. And then from another aspect, say you're a business heavy podcast and you're going to do solo episodes or you're going to do guest interviews. I think you can mix up solo episodes and guest interviews,
Totally.
but maybe not so much. Okay, one episode, we're going to take you on this weird story somehow that's more narrative, like a true crime, but we're still talking about entrepreneurship. And then next week we're going to a guest interview and just completely throwing everybody off.
Totally.
But I think as long as you're in the same like realm, it's okay to switch things up.
I agree with you. I think that especially like when it comes to guest interviews versus solo episodes and all that kind of stuff, like there's different structures for each of those types of podcasts, right? Where it's like a lot of the questions that I get often is like, but how should I structure it? Like, what should I do? What should I include? And so if there's something tangible that I think people could kind of grasp onto is, you know, most podcasts, and this is kind of like a rule of thumb, if you will, you'll want to have some kind of intro to your show, right? Like I have clients who will have like a regular intro, like just actually introducing the podcast. They'll put that first, and then they'll put the musical intro, and then they'll go right into the content, and then they'll have their musical outro. And then I have other clients who have their musical intro first, and then their actual intro to the podcast, the content, the main content, right? And then the outro. Some people record an additional outro and add it in. You know, some people will create, like I have one client who does like a small snippet right at the beginning. Then she does her musical intro. Then she does like the actual episode and then the outro. And some people don't create separate intros at all. Like they just do it all in one shot, right? And so I think that there's so many different ways to create your show. And so like you were saying with listen notes, like going back and like listening to your favorite podcast, to podcasts that you really like, and like analyzing and paying attention to like what's the structure of their podcasts, right? And how are they structuring their show, and like what do you like, what do you not like, what's feasible for you in your schedule and your life, and like what's not, you know?
Yeah, I think now I'm tracking the structure of the episode itself.
Yeah.
So,
but I get what you were saying though before too, because it's true, because I think that's a really good permission slip for people to, and I didn't mean to cut you off, but I think it's a really good permission slip for people that like, if you tried it one way and you don't like it, change it. Like it's not the end of the world. But once you find whatever you like, maybe stick to it.
Right. At least to some extent, some level of consistency.
Yeah.
Because we're building expectations for the audience. When they come in, they're going to expect a certain thing after a certain point.
Exactly.
Now I've played around with different structures as far as like the intro and outro. I'll typically, I like to record both after I've already recorded the episode.
Yeah.
But I like to get in there before the intro music hits to kind of set the tone for the episode. So I'd like to kind of tease, get people excited about it in that introduction. And then when that music hits, it's like, okay, we know we're going into the interview.
Exactly.
But I have also played around with pulling clips from the episode as kind of like a tease as well. But I always end up coming in here and saying, hey, that person you just heard, that was Simona. She was talking all about this. We're about to get into all of that right now in this episode. So get ready. And then boom, music.
And then we
jump right into the interview.
I love that. Do you find that like one style would like perform better than like another? Like, you know what I mean? Like, can you tell? It's so hard to tell.
Yeah, it is difficult to tell. I think when I started doing that, I was actually when I was adding the clip from the episode, I was getting feedback from a few people that were saying like, hey, I really liked how you kind of teased that piece of the episode where the guest was like talking about something really cool. And then you kind of broke it down a little bit before you jumped in. Like that's what kind of sucked me in. Oh. So after I did that once, I was like, okay, I'm just going to keep doing that then. That's my new format. But that just goes to show and exactly what we're talking about. It doesn't have to be set in stone, and you don't have to be afraid to test and try different things like that, because people are going to tell you, hopefully, which direction to go.
Yeah.
And I mean, that is now my standard format for my show.
I love that. Oh, that's so cool. That's a really good idea. I like that. Oh, there's so many great ideas in this episode. I love this. I love it. I love when there's like actual like tangible things that people can take away and like implement and like think about something differently and, you know, open up their perspective to something new. Because I think a lot of the times, especially in like this industry, when you're doing something alone, a lot of the time it's easy to get like stuck and you're like, okay, well, this is how I do it, because it's like that age old thing of like, but this is how we've always done it, you know? And that's like the most like dangerous like saying that ever. Like if that's how you've always done it, like maybe look outside the box a little bit, and not because it
Now's the
doesn't
time
work.
to start looking different.
Yeah, exactly. And like not because it doesn't work, but only because like just to, you know, is there anything that could be elevated? Is there anything could be done differently? Is there anything that maybe you like better than what you're already doing now? Okay, Nick, this was super helpful and it was super great helping people figure out what are the main things and the main components that they actually need for their podcast, from your name to your niche to your show description to your cover art, intro, outro, trailer, music, show structure, all of the things. Is there anything that you think is important for our listeners today to pay attention to? Any final words as we close out this episode today?
Think about who your audience is. Understand your why, your why, your why, your why. And then research is your best friend. There's how many podcasts out there already that have been successful and not. And we don't need to try and reinvent the wheel, so to speak, with a lot of this stuff. People have figured it out and they've been successful with it. So use what they've learned and what they're sharing to your advantage.
I love it.
I'm a huge proponent in taking a look at what other people are doing, because it can give us a lot of influence in the direction that we should go.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Nick. Now, I know that this episode is going to be so helpful for you when it comes to launching your show. And I know it's also going to be helpful as you tweak and shift and evolve your existing podcast. There's so much value shared here about what really goes into, on a nitty-gritty level, the small details that come with creating a podcast. You can connect with my friend Nick on Instagram. His handle is @95free. I've put the link to his Instagram channel in the show notes, and I've also put all of the links to his website and other social media channels in the show notes as well, so you can connect with him there. Let him know that you're listening. Let us both know that you're listening. We want to hear what was impactful for you. We want to hear what you loved from this conversation. So be sure to head on over to Instagram and let us know. Be sure to also screenshot this episode and tag us so that we know that you've heard this conversation. I am so grateful for you. Thank you so much for subscribing to the podcast so that you never miss an episode, leaving a comment about the show and a rating as well. I'm so grateful for you for your time, and thank you for joining us in this episode. I will see you on the next one.